Academic Listening Encounters, Life in Society. Listening, Note-Taking, and Discussion by Kim Sanabria. Series Editor Bernard Seal. Published by Cambridge University Press. These CDs contain the listening material for the Academic Listening Encounters, Life in Society Students Book. This recording is copyright. CD 1. Chapter 1. Marriage, Family, and the Home. Page 3. Listening for Numerical Information. Step 2. 1.
Most adults in the United States get married, but many get divorced. The U.S. divorce rate is rising. About 50% of all U.S. marriages will end in divorce.
2.
About half of all children in the United States spend some time in a single-parent family.
3.
The average size of an American family today is about 3 people. Some studies say that it might be even smaller.
4.
There are also many alternative family arrangements today. For example, more than 50% of young couples live together before they get married.
5.
Today, about 1 in 10 households consists of only one person.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 1. Marriage, Family, and the Home. Page 5. Listening for details. Step 2.
Hello, Robert. I'd like to talk to you about your family.
Well, probably the most important influence in my life was my family. Not just my mother and father, but my extended family. I grew up very close to them. I never really sought people out besides my family. And we lived together in a 3-generation house.
3 generations in one house?
Yes, we all lived together in a big house. My mother had never in her whole life lived without her parents.
Wow, that is amazing.
Well, my house had my grandparents. My grandfather was still working. He wasn't retired. My grandmother, my mother, and my father. I remember feeling when I was in the car and we were going someplace, I used to feel sorry for all the other children on the street because they weren't going anywhere with their own families. So I was very happy.
Weren't there ever any problems with you all living in the same house?
Well, there was a time when I was in college. And you see, my father always wanted his children with him. He was actually more protective of us than my mother was. And I remember I had a big project to do for school, and they were going away for the weekend, and I had decided that I wasn't going to go because I needed to do my work. And this caused a terrible problem. And I did end up going because my father was so upset. So I think, of course, as I got older, I started to realize that I had to live my own life. But it wasn't that easy.
How many children were there?
Well, I was the oldest of 3 boys. And of course, since my grandparents lived in the house, my cousins and my aunt and uncle came to the house. And we used to dance and roller skate in the basement and play together. I didn't play with children on my block very much.
It sounds like you had a really good upbringing.
Well, I have very positive feelings about my family. And the most positive feeling is love. What I learned from different people in my family are perhaps some of my best traits. My father was a very generous person, and I learned that you should care about other people. And my grandparents and parents shared the same values.
Well, Robert, when you look around today and see that there's more divorce, more single-parent families, what do you think?
I think that many things have changed in society today. I mean, the whole world has changed, and the definition of family has changed. I think that families are not necessarily blood relations, but it's important to belong to some kind of unit where people care about you and love you.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 1. Marriage, Family, and the Home. Page 7. Paraphrasing what you have heard. Step 2.
Carlos, I know you grew up in a single-parent household. Can you tell me about your family?
Okay, my mother and father migrated to the U.S. from Puerto Rico when I was 5 years old and my sister was 3. But then my mother left my father, so it was just my mother, my sister, and myself. And my mother was a garment worker, sewing. But that industry is seasonal, so when there was work, she worked a lot. Then she would find people to take care of us until she got home. When we were a little older, we pretty much took care of ourselves.
Did you play with other kids in the neighborhood much?
Oh yeah, there was a good stretch when I was in junior high school and played out in the street a lot. After school, I'd be out and just play stickball, marbles, yo-yos, and just run around the neighborhood.
What kinds of lessons do you think you learned from your mother?
Well, I guess there were 2 things. The first thing I remember is being taught to pretty much take care of myself. Picking up after myself around the house. And I remember her teaching me cooking, cleaning, and ironing. And I remember running errands because at dinner time, there was always something she'd forgotten to get.
You said you learned 2 lessons.
I guess the other lesson was just, how important it is to get an education. I remember she wanted us to learn Spanish, so she brought a blackboard and started teaching us in the house.
Well, Carlos, over the past generation or so, family structure has changed a lot. How important do you think these changes are?
Well, I don't really know if it has changed that much. Sure, there's been an increase in single-parent households, but I don't know if the family has really changed. Who are you talking about? Rich people? Poor women have always had to work outside the house. That hasn't changed too much. But what I do think is important is having a person in the family who does what has to be done to show you the right way, so that you can get an education, moral instruction, religious outlook, some positive influence in your life, an anchor in your life. So, for example, school was very influential in my life. There were enough good teachers to really point me in the right direction. It's not just what you get in the home, but other positive influences as well.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 1. Marriage, Family, and the Home. Page 11. Note-taking. Listening for main ideas and supporting details. Step 1. 1.
First then, let's discuss rewards. A reward can be defined as a positive reinforcement for good behavior.
2.
Punishments are the second important way in which a child is socialized. All of us have probably been punished in our lives. For example, maybe our parents stopped us from going out with friends because we did something we were not supposed to do.
3.
Parents can set a good example by showing children the kind of behavior they expect. Let me give you a personal example. I know a boy called Peter who told me he liked to study because his mother studied with him.
4.
There's an old saying in English, don't do as I do as I tell you. But this advice doesn't work most of the time. Some studies have suggested that if you smoke yourself, it's probably ineffective to tell a child not to smoke.
5.
So, understandably, parents are often worried about the negative lessons that children can learn. For example, from other children or from TV. TV can send children a lot of negative messages. In fact, it's been estimated that on average, 80% of programs contain violent behavior.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 1. Marriage, Family, and the Home. Page 13. Note-taking. Organizing your notes in columns. Step 2.
Hi, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about how children learn social behaviors, especially how they learn lessons from the family, the most basic unit of our social structure. There's a lot of discussion these days about how families are changing and whether non-traditional families have a good or bad effect on children. But it's important to remember that the type of family a child comes from is not nearly as important as the kind of love and support that exists in the home. I'd like to focus on 3 of the ways that children acquire their behavior: through rewards, punishments, and finally, modeling. First then, let's discuss rewards. A reward can be defined as a positive reinforcement for good behavior. An example of a reward is when a parent says, "If you eat your vegetables, you can have ice cream for dessert." Or a parent might say, "Finish your homework first, then you can watch TV." Most parents use rewards unconsciously because they want their children to behave well. For example, a parent might give a gift to a child because the child behaved well. Or parents might give a child money for doing what the parents asked. The opposite of a reward is a punishment. Punishments are the second important way in which a child is socialized. All of us have probably been punished in our lives. For example, maybe our parents stopped us from going out with friends because we did something we were not supposed to do. Or maybe they wouldn't let us watch TV because we got a bad grade on a test. Both rewards and punishments are controversial. Many people think that they are not effective or necessary, especially when used often. Let's take this situation. A young boy has been asked to take out the garbage. Listen to situation A. The parent says, "If you take out the garbage for me, I'll give you a cookie." Some people argue that this reward is unnecessary because it's like a bribe. They argue that the child should be taught that it's his duty to help with household chores and that he should not get a special reward for doing something that's his responsibility. Situation B would go something like this. "Justin, please take out the trash now." And Justin says, "Okay, Dad." Not surprisingly, punishment is extremely controversial, especially when the punishment is physical. Some of us grew up expecting to be spanked if we misbehaved. For example, our parents may have hit us on the hand if we talked back to them. But I don't agree that spanking can teach children anything, and sadly, some children are subject to really serious physical abuse. According to a study I just read, 1 in 22 children is a victim of physical abuse. Children who come from homes where violence is used to solve problems are much more likely to abuse their own children when they become adults and have their own families.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 1. Marriage, Family, and the Home. Page 15. Note-taking. Organizing your notes in columns. Step 2.
The third way that children are taught how to act is through modeling. Modeling means that they learn to behave by following an example. Modeling is probably the most powerful way that children learn social skills. Children look for role models in their life, meaning people who they admire and want to copy. Children's first role models are their parents. Parents can teach children by modeling appropriate behavior, as various researchers have noted. Parents can set a good example by showing children the kind of behavior they expect. Let me give you a personal example. I know a boy called Peter who told me he liked to study because his mother studied with him. This is an important lesson that he learned just by copying his mother's behavior. There's an old saying in English, "Don't do as I do as I tell you." If you say that to a child, it means that the child should not copy what you do, but instead just do what you were telling the child to do. But this advice doesn't work most of the time. Some studies have suggested that if you smoke yourself, it's probably ineffective to tell a child not to smoke. The child will most likely think, well, my mother smokes, so why shouldn't I? Modeling is the most important way that children learn. And of course, parents are not the only people teaching children. Other family members and friends are also models. Many people do not even realize the impact they can have on a child that they know. But children carefully watch other people around them and notice the way they behave. It's important to note here that it is common for babysitters, relatives, and child care centers to take care of children as well as parents. So children are exposed to many models of behavior. They learn from each other, from their teachers, and from society itself. So, understandably, parents are often worried about the negative lessons that children can learn. For example, from other children or from TV. TV can send children a lot of negative messages. In fact, it's been estimated that on average, 80% of programs contain violent behavior. I'd like to conclude by reminding you, again, that the most important thing for children is to grow up in an environment where there are fair rules that are clearly established and followed consistently by everyone. If the child knows what the expectations are, he or she will find it much easier to acquire good behavior. And if the child is loved and exposed to strong, positive role models, the child will quickly begin to grow in a healthy way.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 2. The Power of the Group. Page 18. Listening for specific information. Step 2.
Would you go to the wedding, Rebecca?
Of course I would. If it's your family, you're kind of expected to go along, aren't you?
I disagree. I wouldn't go. I'd say I had to work that weekend or make some excuse like that.
Okay, Jim, would you go to the movie with your friends?
Yeah, sure. It might be good. Reviews aren't always right.
I'd go too. I agree. Sometimes the newspaper says that a movie's no good, but it turns out you like it. And even if it's bad, I'll have a good time with my friends anyway.
And the shoes, Rebecca, would you consider buying them?
Well, maybe not buying them, but I might try them on. They might look good on me. And if everyone's wearing them, perhaps they're really comfortable or something.
No way. I don't care what my friends think. Fashion is a personal choice.
All right, last question. Would you go away with your parents?
Definitely not. I really don't want to spend the whole weekend with my parents' friends, especially if I have to study.
Me neither. My mom would probably put pressure on me to go. She'd tell me that I could do my work in the country, but I wouldn't want to spend a weekend with their friends either.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 2. The Power of the Group. Page 20. Listening for main ideas. Step 2.
Henry, they say that adolescence is the time when people begin to get most pressure from their peers. Do you think that's true?
What I've seen is that adolescence is the time when the pressure begins to shift from the family and the school to friends. I think it begins about 11, but comes into full bloom at about 13, 14.
What actually happens then?
Well, the first thing you see is that adolescents begin to make fashion statements. And certainly those ideas don't come from you. You can tell at a glance that they don't come from you, like wearing baggy pants that look like they're falling down and, piercing their ears. My younger son began to ask if he could dye his hair blue.
And what did you say?
We said when he was a little older he could make that decision, with the hope that that fad would have passed out of style.
Okay, but where would you draw the line? I mean, you'd let him wear baggy pants, but would you let him dye his hair?
I think in the end I would, but not without a fight.
So what other things happen?
Well, as the kids get older, you start to lose them, because they're always talking on the phone, or talking online, or doing other things, even when they're home. They're in their room most of the time, talking on the phone, and not just talking on the phone. They might be talking to one person on the phone and two other people online. And the only thing you know for sure is they're not talking to you.
Do you think this is all normal behavior? I mean, should you be trying to monitor it?
I think both. It's healthy to develop your own values, your own taste, but I also think that parents should be monitoring it. When it's a question of fashion, that's okay. Where you draw the line is when they're doing something dangerous or illegal. Drugs, smoking, drinking.
Is there any advice you could give parents?
Well, one thing is to think back to your own experience as a teenager. I must say I find myself repeating the same annoying language my father used with me, and I have to try to remember not to do that.
So how you talk to your kids is important.
Yes, and it's hard to watch your kids doing things you don't want them to do. For example, my kids are into video games, and I can't find any value whatsoever in these games. But I think that you don't have to like everything your kids do, as long as it's not dangerous or illegal.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 2. The Power of the Group. Page 21. Listening for specific information. Step 2.
Hey, Victor, how old are you?
I'm gonna be 12 next month.
Well, I'm asking people about peer pressure. You know who your peers are, right?
Peers?
Your friends. You know, people in your class.
Oh, yeah.
Well, do you think that they have a lot of influence on you? Like, for instance, do you ever change your mind about something because of what your friends say?
Well, sometimes.
Can you give me an example? A time when your friends influenced you?
Well, all my friends have this video game, and I want one too. So I asked my mom, but she said it's a waste of money. But my friend Marcos has one, and I really like it. So I'm gonna ask my dad if he can get my mom to change her mind.
Good luck with that, Victor. But why do you think your friends influence you?
I guess I'm just jealous because I want a video game too. Loads of people in my grade have that video game, so I want it.
So you think you want that game mostly because your friends have one?
Sure, I suppose so.
Thanks a lot, Victor. Samira, you're a sophomore in high school, right?
Uh-huh, 10th grade.
And would you say that your peers, your friends, and the people you hang out with have a lot of influence on you?
Totally. I mean, we talk about everything, and, I have my own opinions about stuff and all that, but we always talk everything over.
How important is it for you to be one of the group?
Well, you don't want to be just like sheep, do everything that everyone else is doing. I mean, you've got to think for yourself. You can't conform all the time. But sure, my friends influence me a lot.
More than your parents?
Well, probably, at this point, yes.
Why do you think peers have so much influence over each other?
Well, you're in the same boat, right? I mean, you share your culture. You share who you are.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 2. The Power of the Group. Page 26. Note-taking. Listening for organizational phrases. Step 3. Listen to these phrases from the lecture.
The subject of today's lecture is I'm going to focus on 3 main ideas in this lecture. First of all, we will consider secondly, I will describe. Finally, I'll mention first then, now let's turn to conclude, let's look at
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 2, The Power of the Group. Page 27. Note-taking. Organizing your notes in outline form. Step 2.
the subject of today's lecture is culture shock, group pressure in action. Culture shock, as you know, is the term used to describe the experience many people have when they travel to another country, and it can be seen as a manifestation of group pressure in action. It is a good example of group pressure because it shows what happens when an individual suddenly experiences different cultural rules, the rules of another cultural group. Now, culture shock is a complex phenomenon, but I'm going to focus on three main ideas in this lecture. First of all, we will consider the reasons why people experience culture shock. Secondly, I will describe the different stages of this experience. Finally, I'll mention some possible applications of this research, because although you might think that culture shock affects, say, only travelers, that is not the case. In fact, cross-cultural studies have immense practical value for modern society. First, then, why do people experience culture shock? Think about this for a minute. When you grow up in a particular set of surroundings, naturally you get used to the rules and guidelines that govern the behavior of the people around you. In a sense, you become totally dependent on the rules of your social group. You tend not to question them. You just accept them without thinking. These rules are often not clearly articulated, and therefore you're not aware of their impact. In other words, you are not necessarily conscious of them. They only become important when, for example, you go to another country or a different environment that's governed by a different set of rules. In fact, this experience can be so shocking that it has been compared to having a bucket of cold water thrown over you. Culture shock happens precisely because you cannot use your own culture as a map to guide your own behavior and your own understanding of what surrounds you. You're totally out of control, just as if you were driving along a highway in the dark without a road map. And because of this, people often behave irrationally. It's a highly stressful experience, and there are different symptoms in different stages.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 2, The Power of the Group. Page 29. Note-taking. Copying a lecturer's diagrams and charts. Step 2.
Now, let's turn to the different stages of culture shock. Most researchers agree that there are three main stages. If you were to depict it on paper, you might draw a wave shape, as I've done in this diagram. The first stage, the crest or highest part of the wave, is often referred to as the honeymoon stage. It's the time when you first arrive in a new culture and are confronted with a whole set of different rules. What are the emotions that you experience during this time? Even though this is a new and often strange experience, people don't usually react with fear. Surprisingly, there is often a feeling of euphoria. The most common reactions at this time are excitement, fascination, and enthusiasm. Of course, you're on your guard because of the strangeness of the situation. But at this stage, cultural differences are likely to seem exciting rather than threatening. The second stage has been called the letdown. Here are some feelings that people experience during this phase: irritation, hostility, and confusion. They might also feel exhausted, lonely, and nervous. These feelings happen because travelers have to unlearn their own cultural habits and values as they spend more time in a new country and are expected to function according to the ways of that place. They may feel like lost children without protection. They probably want to go home, but if they can't do that, they spend a lot of time with other people from their own country in order to get back a sense of safety. The final stage is one of resignation. Even if visitors aren't completely comfortable, they do become adjusted to the new environment. Or at least they stop feeling that they need to defend their own culture every time they encounter a habit or value they don't easily recognize. They might never recapture the honeymoon period, but they're not as depressed as they were during stage 2. To conclude, let's look at some practical applications of the research. Well, remember, I mentioned that it doesn't just apply to tourists on vacation or even international students. In our world of rapid transportation and population mobility, many societies have recent immigrants, sometimes in large numbers. This becomes a general social challenge because immigrants are going through even more cultural shock than tourists. Furthermore, older residents of a country with large numbers of new immigrants can experience their own form of internal culture shock when they see neighborhoods or even larger regions where people speak a foreign language or eat unfamiliar food or behave according to cultural patterns brought from their own countries. Because cultural differences can sometimes lead to tense relationships between different ethnic groups, it is vital that people try to learn as much as possible, get some cross-cultural training if they can, about the different cultures in their own societies. Because the more we learn about our differences, the easier it is to live in a world where different cultures have to live in close contact with each other.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 3. Growing Up Male or Female. Page 34. Building background knowledge on the topic. Step 2. 1.
What are little boys made of? Frogs and snails and puppy dogs' tails. That's what little boys are made of. What are little girls made of? Sugar and spice and all things nice. That's what little girls are made of.
2.
Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick.
3.
Polly, put the kettle on. Polly, put the kettle on. Polly, put the kettle on. We'll all have tea. Lucy, take it off again. Lucy, take it off again. Lucy, take it off again. They've all gone away.
4.
Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, eating her curds and whey. Along came a spider and sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away.
5.
Georgie, Porgy, Pudding and Pie kissed the girls and made them cry. When the boys came out to play, Georgie, Porgy ran away.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 3. Growing Up Male or Female. Page 36. Answering multiple choice questions. Step 2.
Hi, Linda. I'd like to ask you about bringing up a son in today's world.
I think the most critical issue is to raise a son who's proud of being himself, who'll be a good parent and a good husband. The other thing is that he should be sensitive to the issues that women have.
And how are boys' issues different from girls?
Boys tend to be more competitive. They're expected to be a lot tougher. They're expected to excel in sports, and a lot of social relationships and friendships grow out of sports. So it's who you're playing basketball with, or are you on the football team? Girls tend to form groups more easily without sports.
You know, I read somewhere that men need to do something, like sports, to get together.
Yeah, that's true. When boys are younger, school brings them together. But later, men tend to use sports as that thing they do together. They talk about sports, and there's a major bonding that goes on around sports.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
And some people think that boys are closed emotionally, but I think that boys now share a lot of their intimate feelings with other boys. Of course, they still tease each other very harshly and relentlessly. But they're more open about things that scare them than they were in the past.
What kinds of things do you think that boys are scared of?
I think they're scared of not being accepted, of not being liked, of not being intelligent enough, of not being strong enough, of not being fast enough, of not being attractive enough.
Do you think it's harder to bring boys up these days?
Yes. In the old days, roles were more prescribed. But there's a lot more flexibility now. You have to know how to make a role for yourself, structure yourself. You don't go into your dad's business. There's no lifetime employment anymore. It's a lot more exciting and creative and challenging, but it's also scary. It takes a lot more inner strength, I think.
Linda, when you look at your son, what are your dreams and hopes for him?
I want him to grow up to be a really good person. I want him to be very, very caring, to be a good husband and a good friend who understands that he's a member of society and he has certain responsibilities towards society. And I want him to be financially stable, but not necessarily wealthy. And I'd like him to love whatever he does for a living, because I think that's what makes a happy man, a happy father, a happy person.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 3. Growing Up Male or Female. Page 38. Listening for specific information. Step 2.
Shingo, were the boys and girls in your family brought up with the same rules?
Well, I have a younger brother and sister. My sister's the youngest. And of course my parents care about me and my brother, but they take care of my sister more. Like they shelter her more. For example, it was okay for me to move to the US from Japan and work here. They didn't mind that I wouldn't be that close. And I like doing things by myself. I don't want to be restricted. I like the freedom.
And your sister?
They just want her to stay around them, marry someone close by. When she was growing up, she never really wanted to go out. She mostly stayed in her room, or went shopping or wherever with my parents. And now she's 20, but she still hangs out with them a lot, more than we ever did.
Don't your parents worry about you and your brother?
Of course, but they feel like we're going to be okay, because we've always been very independent. But my sister is always with my parents. If she goes shopping, they pay for her, everywhere.
But do you think that's because of her personality, or is it because she's a girl?
Well, it's definitely because she's a girl that she's so shy. And I guess my parents just expect her to be with them longer than we were.
And cooking. Did your parents teach you how to cook?
No, but they didn't teach my sister either.
So who cooked in your house?
My mother. But I learned to cook from cookbooks. When I left Japan, I had to cook for myself, and I like cooking. When we were in elementary school, everyone learned a little bit of cooking. And girls did sewing too.
And what about later on?
Well, in junior high school, the boys did woodwork, and girls carried on with cooking and sewing. But nowadays, there's less discrimination than there used to be. So in my opinion, you have to give kids choices. And if the girls want to do woodwork, we should let them. If boys want to sew, why not? Things are becoming more and more equal. Let kids do whatever they want. That's one of the most important things.
And it doesn't matter if they're boys or girls.
No, it doesn't matter to me. My parents let me have a lot of freedom. I want to do the same thing for my children. If they want to be independent, that's okay. And if they need a lot of my support, I'll give it to them. Like my parents do to my sister. You have to be flexible.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 3. Growing Up, Male or Female. Page 43. Note-taking. Using symbols and abbreviations. Step 3.
I'm going to be discussing the benefits of single-sex education. As a teacher and advisor in an all-girls school, I am often asked to defend single-sex education, specifically all-girls education, as if girls' schools were on trial. I personally strongly recommend single-sex education for girls, but the arguments against this form of education can be quite powerful. So I would like to begin by pointing out 3 of the main arguments against all-girls schools.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 3. Growing Up, Male or Female. Page 45. Note-taking. Using symbols and abbreviations. Step 2.
I'm going to be discussing the benefits of single-sex education. As a teacher and advisor in an all-girls school, I am often asked to defend single-sex education, specifically all-girls education, as if girls' schools were on trial. I personally strongly recommend single-sex education for girls, but the arguments against this form of education can be quite powerful. So I would like to begin by pointing out 3 of the main arguments against all-girls schools. First of all, critics of all-girls schools argue that the separation of the sexes seems old-fashioned. It goes against the aims and the goal of feminists and liberal educators, which is to provide fairness, to make sure boys and girls have the same educational opportunities and are treated in the same way. Secondly, the critics say that in single-sex schools, boys and girls can't develop the ability to interact with one another. They point out that in single-sex schools, boys and girls can't learn how to be comfortable with each other and also how to compete with each other. The third criticism is that single-sex schools don't provide children with a smooth transition into the adult world where men and women live together. In single-sex schools, these critics say, boys and girls cannot become prepared for a world in which they will work, play, and live together as adults. But although these are serious arguments, I believe that single-sex education is beneficial for girls. In the second part of this lecture, I'll focus on 2 strong advantages of single-sex education. It values girls' unique qualities, and it helps girls develop self-confidence.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 3. Growing Up, Male or Female. Page 46. Note-taking. Using your notes to write a summary. Step 1.
The first real benefit of all-girls education is that it values girls' unique qualities, the qualities that make them different from boys. What are these unique qualities? Well, I'm going to list a few. First of all, girls can often concentrate on higher-level abstract thinking at an earlier age than boys can. Secondly, they can often work for longer periods of time. Girls also enjoy collaborative learning activities, and so they work well in groups. Finally, as girls mature, They are often kind and cooperative rather than competitive. These 4 qualities are valued in all girls' schools. The second benefit of single-sex education is that it helps girls develop self-confidence. I strongly believe that girls become more self-confident without the distraction and different learning styles of boys. In a single-sex environment, girls enjoy being leaders. They offer help to others, and they also ask for help when they need it. For example, if they don't understand a math or science concept, they'll ask for clarification. But when girls are in the same classrooms as boys, they often lose their self-esteem. Boys are sometimes louder and may jump up out of their seats and wave their arms in people's faces if they know the answer to a teacher's question. If this happens, girls typically sink back in their chairs and wait for the boys to quiet down. But if there are no boys around, girls can feel free and be themselves. Now, it's true that all girls' schools do separate girls from the real world while they are growing up, but in the real adult world, boys are the ones who set the rules of the game, and these rules don't necessarily reflect the needs or talents of girls. In an all-girls school, girls can become confident enough to challenge the rules, and then perhaps they can change the real world into a place designed to accommodate both women and men.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 4. Gender Issues Today. Page 51. Listening for specific information. Step 3. 1. The employee is going to get married.
If the employee is a man, people think he'll work harder because he'll need to keep his job. But if the employee is a woman, people often think that she'll have a baby and leave her job.
2. The employee has a family picture on his or her desk.
If the employee is a man, people think he loves his family. But if the employee is a woman, people think she's more interested in her husband and her children than she is in her career.
3. The employee is talking with a coworker.
If the employee is a man, people think they're talking about something important. But if the employee is a woman, people usually think they're just chatting.
4. The employee is going to go on a business trip.
If the employee is a man, people think the trip will be good for his career. But if the employee is a woman, they say, "What will her husband think?"
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 4. Gender Issues Today. Page 54. Answering multiple choice questions. Step 2.
Belinda, do you think you've ever been discriminated against because you're a woman?
Well, let's see. I have 2 answers for that. The first answer is yes, that's my gut feeling. But sometimes I think, no, I'm not being discriminated against. I just need to try harder. I guess I'm saying yes and no. Look, we're in a society where, yes, discrimination is definitely going on in the business world. I see women getting paid less than men do for the same position. And often, women get jobs as assistants, but they're the ones who do all the work. Also, there's this old boys club, the support network that men have. Men do help each other, and they could help women too, but they don't.
So then you're saying that men do have an easier time of it?
Yeah, it is easier for men. But I have mixed feelings. Sometimes I think that I'm just making excuses for myself. What I ask myself is, am I good enough? Am I as good as the men? Perhaps I'm not. But I really believe that if I do the work necessary in the business world, I'll be able to be as successful as any man. I think that there's much more of a level playing field than there was before. There's much more opportunity now for women than when I was younger.
And do you think successful women help other women?
Yes, I do. Women tend to think of helping themselves and helping other people, too. And I hope that I can help to increase the opportunities for many young girls, as well as boys.
You want to help boys also?
Of course. It's cool for everyone to be successful. And I do see progress in the future, I really do.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 4. Gender Issues Today. Page 55. Answering true-false questions. Step 2.
I'd like to ask your opinion about how gender roles are changing. Do you think there's real equality now?
That's absolutely not true. The first thing is that there's still a pay disparity. Women make only about 70% of the dollar that men earn. There have been changes in the last 20 years or so, but they've been relatively modest. And there's still that glass ceiling, where women hit this invisible barrier as they try to move up.
Could you give me an example of the glass ceiling?
Well, look at this. I'm a social worker. 90% of my colleagues are women, but both the CEO and his boss are men. So the top executives are men, and the lower paid levels, most of them are women. I think that men are much more likely to be raised with a sense of entitlement than women.
And what about equality at home?
I don't think there's equality there either. You see, I think that gender differences often operate on unconscious levels. It almost never occurs to men that they can do housework just as well as women, or take care of children, even if they're divorced and have custody of a child. But women have been parenting children alone forever, and women just assume that they can do it.
How has this affected you in your own life?
Well, with both my children, from 2 different marriages, I was always the person who got up at night and gave the baby a bottle. I was always very actively involved with caring for my children, cooking for them. And I joined a play group with my son 25 years ago. Incidentally, I was the only male involved, and I loved it.
Good for you.
That was very, very different from my father's generation. My father had almost nothing to do with us until we were 8 or 10. He held us and gave us some smiles and so on, but he wasn't really an active parent. But I was determined to be a part of the joy of it all.
So, what you're saying is that the situation has changed, but there's still inequality.
Oh, yes, I think that's true. Absolutely.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 4. Gender Issues Today. Page 60. Note-taking. Using telegraphic language. Step 2. 1.
It's a question of equality. For example, when people say mankind, it sounds as if they're only talking about men. But when you say human beings or people, then you include both men and women.
2.
I, for one, would say that if we speak about people in certain ways, that definitely has an influence on the way we think about them. Imagine a little girl who grows up hearing chairman, chairman, chairman. What is she going to think of when she hears this word? A man, of course.
3.
The title of this lecture is Gender and Language. What I'm going to discuss more specifically is the topic of sexism in language and how to avoid it.
4.
Let's turn to the question of gender-specific terms. Many terms like mailman or policeman are gender-specific. They all refer to men. Yet there are women who do these jobs.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 4. Gender Issues Today. Page 62. Note-taking. Using telegraphic language. Step 2.
Good morning. Please take notes on today's lecture. Everyone should pick up his pen. Or rather, everyone should pick up her pen. Or everyone should pick up his or her pen. Or her or his pen. Wait, let me start again. Everyone should pick up their pen. Is that correct? You get my point, right? The title of this lecture is Gender and Language. What I'm going to discuss more specifically is the topic of sexism in language and how to avoid it. First, then, is it true that language can be sexist? The answer is yes, it can. Take the example of this word, Mr. What word has the same meaning for women? There is none. There's Mrs., which means I'm married. There's Miss, which means I'm not married. And then, since the 1970s, we've had Ms., which means it's none of your business whether I'm married or not. Well, not exactly, but you get my point. Let's turn to the question of gender-specific terms. Many terms like mailman or policeman are gender-specific. They all refer to men. Yet there are women who do these jobs. So what do? Well, a safe option is to use what we call gender-neutral terms, such as mail carrier or police officer. Why should we use gender-neutral language? Well, first of all, because it describes the world the way it really is. If children grow up hearing the word chairman, then they internalize the idea that all leaders are men, which isn't true. Secondly, it's a question of equality. For example, when people say mankind, it sounds as if they're only talking about men. But when you say human beings or people, then you include both men and women. But vocabulary isn't the only problem. Grammar is a problem too. Do you remember the example I gave at the beginning? Everyone should pick up blank pen. Well, I wasn't really making a joke. The fact is, I have to choose a pronoun. And I don't want to give the impression that everyone in the room is male or female either. So I'm facing a dilemma. What's the solution? Well, personally, I prefer to say everyone should pick up their pen. I realize this is not grammatically correct, but it does avoid sexism. And you'll find that most university professors and writers would probably make the same choice that I do. Look at the newspaper, or look around you on the bus or on the subway. You'll see plural pronouns in places you might not expect.
Now complete the steps in your book. Chapter 4. Gender Issues Today. Page 63. Note-taking. Using telegraphic language. Step 2.
Now, I'd like to organize the second part of the lecture around your questions. I can see that some of you have questions on your mind, so please go ahead and ask them.
Professor Gavis, I'm sorry, but is all this concern about language really important? I mean, aren't there more serious issues facing women today?
You know, I understand what you're saying. And of course, there are many serious issues facing women. I mean, there are so many that I could mention. The AIDS crisis, workplace inequality, the way the mass media treats women, that is, the way they stereotype women, and so on. But I'd like to point out that in addition to these issues, the language question is also on the minds of international organizations, such as the United Nations, who try very hard to avoid sexism in their publications. You see, the issue isn't just the words themselves, but the ideas behind the words. Have you ever thought about the roles that boys and girls play in children's literature? It often seems that the boys are the ones having all the fun, having adventures and so on, while the girls just stand in the background smiling sweetly. You see, women tend to be pushed to the background in society. By focusing on the language we use about women, we may be able to change their expectations.
I have a question about the relationship between the way we think and the way we talk. For example, if we say chair instead of chairman, do you really think we'll start imagining more women in powerful positions?
Again, that's a very interesting question. And yes, it's true that we don't completely understand the relationship between language and thought. So, does what we say affect what we think? The answer is probably yes. I, for one, would say that if we speak about people in certain ways, that definitely has an influence on the way we think about them. Imagine a little girl who grows up hearing chairman, chairman, chairman. What is she going to think of when she hears this word? A man, of course. But we must give young people the idea that women can also enter the professional world and be successful. Any more questions?
Professor Gavis, does this controversy about how we use language exist in other languages too?
Yes, it's definitely receiving more and more attention worldwide. But remember that the feminist movement, which is so active in the United States, has been a major force behind the move to avoid sexist language. It's a complicated issue, however, because the issues of gender and language change from one language to the next. For example, nouns don't have a gender in English, but there are two genders for nouns in Spanish, masculine and feminine. And German has three gender groups. Some nouns are masculine, others are feminine, and there's a third category which isn't masculine or feminine. So each language has its own gender issues. You might want to take a look at some newspapers and magazines to see how they avoid sexism in English. Well, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you.
Now complete the steps in your book. The program continues on the next CD.